So one of the things, as I'm kind of getting to it, when putting this together, obviously that's not all the countries. There is 165 countries that they're looking at. I kind of tried to pick countries that were well known, but also not well known. And then if you notice that there's a chunk of groups from each of the four quartiles, I didn't want to just have the entire thing being, fully developed countries. You want to kind of explore that. The great thing about this lesson is it's super easy to customize and it's super easy to edit towards your class. I saw somebody has 43 students in their class. That sounds bonkers to me, although I do teach a class in the college level, which has more than that. But at a high school level, that seems bonkers to me. Is that you could easily add 40 more or 20 more countries, right? So, and I saw somebody had only 18. This lesson works. Just cut out two countries. It's easy. It's no big deal, right? So just looking through that. All the lessons that Debbie and I are showing to you kind of build upon each other. So I don't know if you've seen that. They're kind of going to go through it. So we're going to do a little bit more of that. You're going to look at Free the World Index, Freedom of the World Index, freetheworld.org. You're going to look at that a little bit more today. All right. So 811 million people live in extreme poverty. We've seen kind of this data before. Here is some World Bank poverty and inequality information. If you have not been on this platform, which we're going to explore today a bit, I really like it. It's very visually appealing. And I really like when my students get to see the actual data. So this is not the best picture. It doesn't have all the axes, but each of these different shades of like a blue-green, they are related to a different area of the world. But what do we notice in general is happening to extreme poverty since 1990? What do we notice? What do you see with this?
It's
Definitely.
gone down.
It's going down. Bill, what were you going to add? And in all areas except one, and it's this kind of this tealish, the one on the top, which is going to be the sub-Saharan Africa. It is every other country is kind of drastically, every other area, excuse me, not country, has drastically dropped their income inequality, and I think that's really or their poverty level, and I think that that's really important and really like amazing to see, is that we have had serious poverty reduction in just our lifetimes. And there's obviously more work to be done, but I think we've done some pretty big moves. So some key terms just to make sure we're all in the same language. The most used measure of poverty are incomes. So we're measuring the owners of resources earned, the money owners of resources earn for contributing their resources. So maybe it's wages and salaries, maybe it's rent payments to people who own natural resources, or interest payments, right? Profit to entrepreneurs. So these are what we're talking about with income. And in developed countries, most people receive their income in the form of money, but in impoverished or developing countries, there's a lot more in-kind income. So got to keep that in mind. So looking through that. So because, and I see a question, Heather, we're going to talk through this more today, or through this. So if you can hang on to the edge of your seats, if I don't fully answer it, we will please bring it up at the end of this. So because production generates income, we talk about total production, which is total income, and that's why we use GDP. And GDP and GNI, the gross national income, they're very similar measurements because in general, what you produce is what you is your income as well. And so when we're thinking about this, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because, sorry. So what I talk about with GDP, right? So you have GDP, and that's just the measure of how much we're producing in this year. But things change year to year, right? There's new stuff, there's new equipment, right? So we want to do real GDP. And the thing that real GDP allows us to do is it allows us to compare across time. So and Debbie gave a really great explanation of this. I want to expand this just a little bit to help how I help my students understand it. Real GDP allows for comparison across time because you're controlling for that inflation. Then you have that GDP per capita, and that's dividing it by the population. And what GDP per capita allows you to do is it allows you to compare across countries. So when you have real GDP per capita, that allows you to compare across time and across countries. And that's really powerful stuff that you can make those comparisons. Now, somebody made a comment about how they like to, or they talk about some of the issues with GDP because it's just talking about an average. And that is 100% true. But here's what I like in GDP to, again, with my students, is I talk about it as a broken scale. So if I'm using a broken scale and my goal is to gain or lose weight, whatever I'm trying to do, and as long as I keep getting on the same broken scale, the trend will be the way it needs to be, right? So if my goal is to gain weight, right? I'm lifting a ton of weights, eating tons of protein, and I have a scale that's off by 5 pounds. As long as I keep using that same broken scale and I'm keep gaining my weight, am I going in the right direction or the wrong direction? I'm going in the right direction. So with GDP, we're using a scale that has some issues, right? It's looking at averages versus something else. It's not a perfect measure. It's also doesn't measure, happiness. It doesn't measure satisfaction, right? It doesn't measure those sort of things, but it is a good measurement and it is a good metric of relative wealth in the country. And you'll see some characteristics and you'll see some things that countries that have higher GDP, they also have tendency.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
our tornado sirens are going off. I'm gonna have to leave.
Okay.
All
Please
right.
take care of yourself.
Yes, ma'am. I'll come back when this warning is over.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Take care of yourself. As somebody who lives in Nebraska with lots of tornadoes, we take those very seriously. So absolutely. Um, oh, sorry, we were talking about kind of the broken scale. So that's what I try to keep in mind, that, we want to make sure that we're kind of staying consistent so that we're telling that consistent story. And that's kind of where I talk about that. Okay, so I'm going to kind of tell you what we're going to do. This is going to be kind of a back and forth data collection slash talk about session. So predominantly you're going to do it. Now, I'm going to put in the chat, if that is easier, this Google Doc, or you can scan it. So if you want to do this on your computer and kind of have it on a separate monitor or have it kind of on the separate screen, or you can do it on your phone or a tablet, whatever you want to do. But what you're going to do is you're getting a Google Sheet. You're getting a Google Sheet, and to edit it, you need to make a copy of it for yourself. And then I want you to follow along with the slides and update your Google Doc as you work through it. So normally I would have this as a group effort in your class. I would divide students up into 3, 4, 5 students, and they would work through this together with me. We're not going to quite do that. And I don't want to go breakout room back and forth because I think we'll lose a lot of time going back and forth. So it's just going to be kind of an independent activity for right now. Okay, so in groups of 2 to 3, which is, whatever, I want you to go to fred.stlouis.org, or this QR code will take you to Fred. And then I want you to search for United States GDP per capita. And I've kind of given you some instructions. Debbie, thank you. So I want you to look through this and I want you to select the constant real GDP per capita. Give oops, Mark, you stole my thunder. Give me like a scream, or not a scream, but like a virtual scream. Use your emotions. Do you love Fred? Who has used Fred? Yeah, you can use like your hands, whatever. You can use the uh where's the reactions? My reaction button's moved. You can use your reaction. Larry loves it. Yeah, Fred is great. If you have not used it, please do, because it is spectacular. And so you're going to kind of keep adding this information into your activity. So here is what Fred looks like. It puts together this really beautiful graph. And as you hover your mouse or your finger or whatever it is over the lines, it tells you all sorts of interesting data. The other thing is, what are these gray bars? Does anyone know what these gray bars are?
Recessions.
Recessions, yeah. And what do we notice happening at the recessions? What's happening to GDP?
Goes
Decrease.
down.
It
Per capita goes
decreases.
down.
Yeah, it decreases, and that's kind of what we, not what we want, but what we expect, because isn't a recession a measurement of declining, falling GDP, right? And what do we notice the trend happening with GDP? It's increasing, right? It's generally increasing, even with those dips. So questions about the graph. So so these are the questions that you're gonna add on activity 7.1, that Google Doc that I sent you, and I'm gonna make a copy. I'm gonna put it in the chat again. So I want you to use the data, use the Fred data. And I want you to answer what's the latest date for data and what is that GDP? Melissa, yes, make your own copy of the Google Docs so that you can edit it. You probably only have viewing access to mine, so if you want to actually type some things on it, then you'll need to make a copy. And I love my students getting into the data because I don't want them to just think I'm making things up, right? I want them to look through it. The cool thing about Fred, as you're kind of looking through this, and this is my plug for Fred, is that they produce really beautiful graphs. And if you create like dashboards, you can always go back and get the latest graph, which I think is spectacular for adding it to my slides. So every year, especially when I'm teaching macro, I go through at the beginning and I try to just update all my stuff. I don't have to spend a ton of time hunting for the graph, which I don't know how you all do, but that takes me forever. I made a copy of the assignment, but what is my search in Fred? Okay, I'm going to go back a couple slides. You're going to search for United States GDP per capita. And then you're going to select the constant real GDP per capita. It's probably that first one. Right? Constant is another term for real and for holding that inflation. It's a slightly different metric than like your real GDP that you're gonna find, but it generally tells you the same thing. If you're thinking,
actually in the search, it's like the fourth one down. I don't know
Oh,
if
is
that
it-
helps anybody.
oh, is it fourth? I thought it was first. Yep.
No,
Or
I
you-
wasn't trying. I'm just saying, I don't know if that helps anybody, but
Perfect. Thank you so much for helping us. Constant real GDP per capita. And you should have a graph that looks something like this. And the great thing is you can, if you've noticed on the bottom, there's like a little bar. You can make it shorter or longer because maybe you only want to talk about since 1980. I don't know. Right? And you can shorten those up. So latest data, David put quarter 4, 2024, right? Remember, data's always lagged. Why don't we have quarter 1 for 2025? Not quite there yet. We're still living quarter 1. What is the general trend of constant GDP per capita? We talked about that a little bit, that it's generally increasing over time. And then those dips are unemployment, or excuse me, recession. Questions? How are we doing? Give me a thumbs up either in real time or on your things. Are we understanding where we're going? Speak now, ask some questions because we're gonna move on. We're gonna kind of, Susan, you still don't see the graph. You don't see something that looks like this? Did you click on that data set? Oh, Debbie, thank you for adding that one too. Now, one of the things that I do like to have my students do is I do like to have them do the searching instead of just providing them the links, because I want them to actually look at how to access the data, right? I want them to actually mess with it. And if we want, I can we're gonna kind of go through this, and I can stop on this one. I want you to pick 5 countries you're interested in. Okay. And I want you to write those countries down on activity 7.1. And you can pick whatever countries you want. And then you're going to actually add it to that. So I am going to, I'm going to go to Fred myself. You can still see you can still see this? Oh, Debbie says, go ahead and close all my shared team slides. You won't need those. So I would look at US real. So you see, I copy it. I look for this all the time. GRP typo. Real gross domestic. Constant GDP per capita. So you should have something that looks like this. Right? Do you see how as I'm hovering over it, it tells you what they are? If you, oh, they've changed it slightly. There used to be like a little dragging. You can look at the last 5 years. You can look at the last 10 years. You can set some customized dates right here. So what you're going to do is you're going to edit the graph right here, click edit the graph, and let's add a line. So you can edit the lines for, it looks like different things, but let's just add a line. So let's look at Canada, real GDP per capita. Now, one thing you want to do is you want to, you want to make sure that you're using kind of the same thing. You don't want to add in nominal GDP, right? Or you don't want to add in real GDP. You want to keep them kind of similar so you can see. So here's Canada, right? Has like the tealish green dotted line, right? It has a similar trend, doesn't it? Very similar trend. Similar trend. I cannot make a copy. And you can add in even more. Give me another country you want to add in.
Ecuador.
Yeah. Ecuador. I don't think it was spelling Ecuador. East, isn't it ACQ?
I think it's
ECU.
ECU.
Uh-huh.
There we go. You want,
Third one.
there we go. So you can add it in and you can see how it is. You can see what it's looking like, right? You can look at all sorts of different things. Yeah, Debbie said using Fred on the phone is tough. You're right, absolutely. It's definitely better on a. I've used it on my iPad. I don't mess with it on my phone too much, other than when I'm trying to prove someone wrong and I need accurate data. It's a good use for that. But you can add lines. The more lines you add, obviously it can get a little bit more confusing. So I tried to keep it around 5. But you can have your students do this. Now, in my intention when I created some of these lessons is that, you know how you had those 20 lessons? What I had planned to do is I planned to collect all 20 of those and then divvy them out, like almost like playing cards. And these are your 5 those are your 5 countries to look at, so that they can kind of consistently be looking through those countries. And that's also a way so that they can look at a wide range, right? There's some rich countries, poor countries, so that they can look through all those rather than just looking at all the countries that maybe are the most prominent to them, just to diversify what they're seeing. While I am on this, I love Visual Capitalist. If you have not gotten into Visual Capitalist, it's phenomenal. There's some really great stuff on there. Here's the top countries by GDP per capita by region. So here is the world. And so this is 2003. Some of their data, some of their visual stuff is lagged, or they just don't update it. They update this stuff pretty regularly. But you can look at what does Europe look like, right? The top 10 countries in Europe, the top 10 countries in Asia, top 10 countries in the Americas. So you can see by region, what are those top countries? And I think that this is a very visually appealing graph for my students to see. And all of these are linked. So all of these are linked in your slides. If you click on this slide, it will send you there. So when you get a copy of this, I try to link everything for you. And then there's this purchasing power parity, right? It tries to more accurately affect or look at the cost of living, because it does differ. And one of my students, whenever we're talking about how much things cost, they always go, well, your money goes so much farther. Well, this is a way to kind of consistently look through that, is to look at their purchasing power. And looks at it. So this is if you click on this, it will send you to a video. You can actually look at the changing of the costs of a Big Mac. So this is April 2020, or April 2000, and you can look at how these countries, how the costs have been changing. which I think is another interesting way to look at this. So we've talked about this, but I'm going to actually maybe spend more time. But shortcomings. So they're used the GDP, PPP, widely useful, helpful, great information, but they have issues. So again, they're averages, and so they depict a standard of living in very general terms that may hide income disparities within a population. So averages are pulled up by a high end, or they're pulled down by a low end. So absolutely. These are things to talk about, that there is this information. You can also find out how the income inequality is in each country too, if that's something you're interested in. So they smooth out those differences. And so, you know, we've talked about this. I think I don't want to go too far into it or reiterate this, but you can definitely talk about this with your students. And I would encourage that you do, because it is important to talk through that. All right. So income is derived from output and used for consumption or savings, right? Which is delayed consumption. So in subsistence economies where savings are non-existent, their current consumption is their output, right? Where there's not a whole lot of delayed spending or that saving. And so sometimes the consumption measurements provide a more reliable indicator of standards of living because we don't have other information. So when we're thinking through this, the different range of the how developed a country is dictates what numbers might be more appropriate to use. So a lot of this stuff, I think what I would encourage you to do is to be flexible, to talk about these issues, to talk about where this is coming from. I think that students that understand some of the issues are less likely to be kind of duped by the media, right? This is one thing when we're talking about unemployment. If you don't understand how unemployment is calculated and how the denominator affects things, there's your math, Mark, right? Those denominators are important. That you can have students that are kind of duped by what's going on. They can tell a different story. So it's really important that we do this. And poverty researchers prefer consumption measures to output-based measurement in developing countries because it's a little bit more precise, right? So there's even a difference in kind of the jargon within like the economics field. I don't think you should necessarily use one over the other. I think it's use both, or use them where appropriate. GDP is kind of a good measurement. It's kind of a general thing. It's fairly easy to understand. There's also household surveys, which are nice. They have the income. Are the economic numbers consistently reliable in countries? I would say predominantly, yes, they do. Like economists who report these numbers do their best. They're also, I think economists do a good job of explaining where the numbers don't come from. So if you look at Free the World, there are several countries that don't have reliable data, and they're not in there. And there's lots of caveats and things like that. Also, one of the reasons why data is lagged is because it's hard to collect this data from all these different countries. And so economists at like the BLS and at the World Bank and the IMF, they're doing a lot of work to try to make this, to verify this and to do all that. But reliability is really important. And as an economist, I think that that's something that we have to make sure that we maintain. Integrity is highly important. So we've talked about this. I'm not going to go over it again. But again, it's meant to skip this slide if you've already done some of these slides, right? The absolute poverty versus relative poverty. But here is a kind of some historical data. And what do you notice? So this is real GDP per capita. It is dated information, and it's in 1990 money. What do you notice? Before you do that, I always have a student that goes, why don't we have data for the US in like the 1,000 and 1,500 range? It always makes me a little like, but what do you notice?
Increasing, but increasing at an increasing rate in the last 200 years.
I love that. And not every country is, right? So in general, we have, for the most part, everyone's increasing. But there are some areas that are increasing at that increasing rate, right? Maybe like that hockey stick growth that you hear about, that traditional growth, which if you're a growth economist, that there's like questions on whether that's the ideal or not. Sometimes it's sustainability, but look at like China's always one that is amazing to me, right? Really low GDP per capita, extremely, poor, right? And then just in a pretty short amount of time, 50 years, that
Okay.
massive increase. And then again, another massive increase from 2003 to 2008. Why? Susan?
Oh, yeah, I couldn't find the little hand thing. It's interesting because I just was teaching about the Industrial Revolution. It's basically a visual representation of countries which industrialized, essentially, Western Europe, United States, and then China resisted industrialization, right? And so I could use this in my history class,
Yes,
Um,
that's a great one.
right? And until the last dynasty was overthrown, and after Mao was out, then we see growth in China. But because that Confucianist ideology, I think, prevented them from industrializing till late.
And a lot of it is the change in the economic institutions that come with that industrialization. Sam said opening up the economy, which I'm assuming you're meaning trade, right? You can almost see when China and India opened trade with the world, their incomes drastically increased, and their incomes measured by real GDP per capita. And in general, the world has become richer. There is still poverty, right? And what I always say when I have a slide like this is, does this mean everybody is richer?
Nope.
Probably not. Does this mean everyone is richer by the same amount? No, right? But in general, are we better off? Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, we've seen this. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to click on that. Here is by region. So I like this one. So you can look at the different regions. There's a lot of lines there. You can see the poverty rates on there. And in general, until the COVID pandemic, poverty was decreasing quite substantially. So 2020, that was a really big hit. It set back poverty reduction by decades. And so we're back on track. But that is I think, a blip, but it's a big blip. And I think that it has a lot of effects. The other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about income and we're talking about poverty is when there's an increase in poverty, we're talking about humans and more humans being in poverty. So I always like to humanize the data. I just did a podcast talking about unemployment. And one of the questions was, is there good unemployment? And I was like, well, when you're talking about unemployment, you're always talking about someone not having a job. So the human side is not always, right? But from an economy standpoint, right, there's better and worse. Okay, so we're going to go back to looking at the data because I think the data is really important and I want you to mess around with this. So you can either search World Bank's Poverty Income Inequality platform. You can use this QR code, or I will copy the link and I'm going to put it in the group chat. So there's 3 ways to find it. What I want you to do in the search bar is I want you to look for the poverty rate for the United States. And then you're going to search for other countries that you had in activity 7.1. So again, this is where you're, if you had those cards from the last one, if you kind of handed it out to all the people, they'd essentially be building kind of a entire profile of these 5 countries or of these 6 countries essentially. So I want you to add that. I am going to go over there, and so you can kind of see what it looks like. Mine always defaults to Indonesia, so I always gotta add United States in there. But I think that it gives a really good snapshot of the poverty and inequality. So poverty rate is 1.25 in 2022. Here's that GNI. Here's some growth rate, right? There's lots of different information on here. This will be my next slide, but here is your what has happened to the share of population and the percent that are living at poverty at $2.15 per day. Now, I do want to make sure you're always mindful of the slides. Like, this looks like the United States has had some massive dips and some massive issues with poverty. But I do want to keep in mind that it is peaking at, the slides are peaking at 1.4%. So if you were to actually put this compared to other countries and to on a different scale, the blips look much, much smaller. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So I just want to make sure you're keeping that in mind. And you can add comparison countries, I believe. So you can, oh, well, there we go. I added Canada. So you could see Canada here, like even comparing Canada to the US would have, it would look even significantly different. So I want you to, I'm going to give you a minute or a couple minutes, not too long because we're kind of going quickly through this, is look at the other countries that you have and add in that to your activity 7.1. One of the standards Mark said is staff class is recognizing deceptive graphs, right? And I wouldn't say that that this is deceptive, but it's just to make sure you're remembering the scale. However, I will say that the scaling is a good tactic that people who create deceptive graphs, they like to use that. So absolutely. So what countries are we looking at? Anyway, shout out one that was in yours.
I'm actually looking at Italy.
I
Italy.
always enjoy the train wreck, which is the
Congo. Okay. So here's poverty in Italy.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh.
But remember, it's 215. It's that absolute poverty. Now, does that mean that there's not a lot of poverty in Italy? But they're looking at that. They're looking at it in the relative poverty versus the absolute poverty. So let's go to Congo, because that was shouted out. Look at that data. 90%, over 90% in 2024 or 2004.
Wow.
And you can also, I didn't say this, you can change this to 365. So you can change the absolute value or the absolute poverty line. You can change that. And so you can see what's happening. Okay. South Africa is an interesting country. I was just there in 2023. It's beautiful, but it is such a weird juxtaposition country because you have such amazing, beautiful things, and it is a huge like tourist spot for much of Europe, but it is so poverty stricken too. It's just such an interesting, like it's just if you want to see two different worlds, South Africa is one of them. So 20.49. So here's what's happening to South Africa. And keep in mind, this is all about collecting data, and it's collecting data from countries. So there's going to be gaps. And that's part of sometimes I think I always tell my students, sometimes the gaps tell you something too. Venezuela has some interesting data, right? Venezuela is also one that it's hard to rely on that data, right? It's hard to rely on that data. Okay, so this is what that graph looked like, right? So I want you to search for that. I'm going to skip this. Economic growth. Joey says, wow, some of this data is really eye-opening. I agree. And that's the whole point of this, is that you can actually see the data. And I think your students really will find this interesting. And I think they'll be visually, like, it'll be very visually stimulating for them. So if we can increase what we can produce per person, then our standard of living rises over time, even in the face of scarcity. So when we're talking about this, economic growth doesn't reduce, or excuse me, it doesn't eliminate scarcity, but what it does is it changes the decisions that you have to make, that you're going to have to make, right? So we in the United States, we still face scarcity, but I'm deciding between, am I going to vacation? I'm going to go to Colorado for a vacation, or am I going to go to Scottsdale, Arizona? I don't know, just making that up. Whereas somebody in South Africa, the decisions they're making is, do I eat or pay for electricity, right? So do you see how we're still facing scarcity, but it's very different. And I think even within a country, the range of scarcity vastly different. However, economic growth is one of the major contributors to rising standard of living and reducing people out of poverty. So if we think about the economy as a pie, that's very fitting as yesterday was Pie Day. I hope everyone celebrated, had their favorite pie or pizza. And so if we reduce poverty by redistributing the income, it's maybe giving the poor a bigger slice of the pie, but it's still the same size of pie. And so if we can reduce poverty through economic growth, we can make the pie bigger, right? And so this is really, I think, a really important thing. And I always use the analogy of, does anyone remember Tostino's pizza? Like those terrible, like 99-cent cardboard pizzas that are like this big, right? I'm looking at the wrong screen, this big. Now, would you rather have a tenth of a pizza this big or a tenth of a Costco pizza? Right? Anyone love, I love a Costco pizza. $10.99 for a pizza that's like this massive, right? What would you rather have a tenth of? I'd rather have a tenth of a Costco pizza. And that's essentially the difference between redistributing from a Tostino's pizza to economic growth of growing your pizza, to getting that Costco size pizza. Okay. We are not going to have time to do this, but I'm going to talk you through it, is that you'd look at economic growth for different countries. You have had some time to look through this to free the world, but you'd add this data also into your graphs and to look through it. I think you had a little bit of time to look through it, and we can look through it at our break as well. But just to kind of keep through it all together. So, and we've talked about this, but what trends have you noticed with GDP, with economic growth, with economic freedom? What have you noticed?
More freedom, the more economic growth and opportunities.
And that's generally what we see, as a whole, and that's kind of the common thing. And the idea is that economic institutions matter. So that economic freedom is really important because it changes the decisions, and it changes the incentives that they face. So I'm going to show you some graphs. Mark, get so excited. I can feel it. You're going to love these. Any other math nerds too, you're going to love these. So the Fraser Institute, what they did is they put the countries into quartiles, and they ranked them by economic freedom. So the bottom 25%, next 25%, 25%, 25%. So if you saw on the corner or on the lesson that Debbie did, you'll see like a 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the quartile they fell in. And so that's ranking it by economic freedom. And then they use that to look at how different are these countries in some different metrics. So let's look through this. So here is economic freedom and income per capita. So the most free countries in general have higher GDP per capitas. I think that's kind of at this point with what you're doing, it's kind of a duh, right? But it's good to see this kind of information. So here is poverty rates. So countries that are generally more free have much, much lower poverty rates. We didn't get a chance to look at all the poverty, or all the different countries, but as you were looking through it, you would make those comparisons, and you and your students would have built kind of a six country kind of profile of economic growth, poverty, GDP per capita, those sort of things. Okay, so here is, I'm going to talk you through these next slides. Okay, so what the Fraser Institute did was they looked at what income share of the poorest 10%. So how much income does the poorest 10% in each of these countries have? And in general, this is kind of shocking, I think, to everyone, is that the poorest 10%, regardless of the country, have about 2.5% of the income. Right? Do you see that? That's pretty amazing. Now, would you rather have 2.5% of the Tostino's pizza or 2.5% of the Costco pizza? Right? Would you rather have 2.5% of the GDP of the least free, which was like 6,800? I think I'm high on that. Or would you rather have 2.5% of 68,000? And so what we see is that even though they have about the same share of the income, the amounts are drastically different. And I think that this is extremely shocking and kind of a really telling thing about how important it is to have how important economic freedom is to reducing poverty. Again, that's not to say that 14,000 is enough or that that's or that it's, you know, the end all be all, but I would much rather be on the lowest 10% in the US, in Canada, in some of these the most free countries than I would in Congo or Venezuela or, you know, some of the Belize and some of these other countries, right? So here is life expectancy, right? Better health outcomes, better food outcomes, right? Stress levels, right? Those sort of things. Here is infant mortality. So infant mortality drastically differs. And I know that the US has a relatively high infant mortality for all of our other metrics, but this is again looking at all the free countries, right? All the 25%, the top 25%. Here is that UN World Happiness Index. So happiness does matter, right? And in general, people are happier in countries with greater economic freedom. I think they feel safer, they feel secure, they have, right? When one of those metrics was soundness of money, right? So with that, 200 years ago, per capita incomes in the world were all relatively similar, but some locations experienced sustained economic growth, and a lot of that is tied to your economic institutions. And so what economists have found is that changing your economic institutions and experiencing the economic growth reduces poverty by 4/5 compared to redistribution. So it's huge gains from actually lifting people out and changing the economic institutions they're experiencing. So what we're going to do, there is a break. There is a break. Come back. We're gonna
Five
go
after.
5. What is it?
We'll come back 5 after the hour.
5 after the hour. So come back 5 after whatever hour you're in. Debbie is going to talk about who wins and who loses, and then we are going to there'll still be another opportunity for some more data if you all haven't, you know, gotten your fill yet. So thank you all, and I'm around if there's questions.